Good morning, everybody, and cordially welcome to that meeting that deals with basic income. And in the program, it stands that you have already had coffee. I hope that you enjoyed your coffee. And then there's a small talk, market to me, current status of the Finnish basic income experiment. I will be pretty short because that part is not the main meaning of this meeting. The main part will deal with Herwig Immervoll's presentation on basic income policies in a couple of OECD countries that the OECD has evaluated. But just to say a few words about the Finnish experiment and the present status of that experiment. There's not that much to say because the experiment is going like a train, a little bit better than trains in Finland, and because everything is paid out in the right time to right persons, and there are not delays as far as I know. And we are gathering data because we are following that experiment through registers mainly, and we are getting data for free during the statistics of social insurance institution of Kela. And our intention is not to say that much about the experiment and results before the end of the experiment. And the reason is that we don't want to contaminate the result because there are, as we know, an contamination effect called Hawthorne effect, where people will change their behavior in the case that they know that they are under special interest. So that we don't tell that much about the experiment, what is going on and which kind of results there are. And actually we don't know yet that much. And there are lots of interest, both internationally and nationally. There are lots of researchers who are contacting us and asking that is it possible to get already the data. We don't have yet data, I can say that. And there is also huge political tension that the politicians want to have results already now. And I think that it's a waste of political effort and waste of let's say so that if we now go out and give data and give out information to politicians, in that case, they will immediately be published in the newspapers. And then the experiment will be totally ruined and destroyed, and it's contaminated. Therefore, we are rather restrictive to say anything about the results. And then there are also rather many research groups that have said that please send us the names and numbers and addresses of people who are included in the experiment so that we will go there and interview them, we will go there and send surveys to them. But there also is that problem that we don't want that anybody goes to the field before the end of 2018 when the experiment is ending. And there are lots of people who are saying that we should have data ex ante and ex tempore to know how people thought before they were included in the experiment. And we are trying to say that that's totally in vain because we have an experiment that's randomized field experiment, and we have a treatment group and we have control group. And we can do everything ex post after the experiment, and because the groups are identical, and if in the end of the day there are differences in the behavior of those two groups, in that case we can draw conclusions, causal conclusions that the differences are caused by the treatment, basic income in quotation marks, that we are paying out, so that we don't know ex ante or ex tempore surveys or interviews going on, because we can do it later and in that way save what can be saved. Then there has been a huge international interest towards this experiment, and I must say that I personally have been very surprised how much international interest there is in this kind of experiment. And I think that it's an indication that something is in the air everywhere, so that digitalization, globalization, and those would-be changes in the labor markets that have gone much further in some other countries than in Finland. They have created a kind of atmosphere that the social security system that was created during the industrial period, it's not anymore adequate to answer all those questions that we have in post-industrial societies. And this is not only a Finnish question, but much more. For example, they are discussing this kind of issues in the States and in some other countries. And somehow an indication of that something is in the air, that there are some other countries that have launched experiments with basic income. We have experiments that are taking place in the Netherlands. They have a little bit different setup as we have here in Finland. In Canada, they are starting an experiment that I think is much better than our experiment. And it's very interesting to see what they will achieve. And there has been experiments in India and in some African countries, and also in some African countries they will launch new experiments. And each of those experiments are a little bit different, and there are different motivations behind those experiments. For example, the Finnish experiment was very much motivated by the government by referring to economic incentives and employment results. And for example, poverty issues, equality questions were not that much prominent in the Finnish discussion and motivation of this experiment. And in some other countries, for example, in India and in African countries, basic income was seen as a solution to solve all kind of social insurance problems. The basic income was seen as a child benefit, sickness benefit, unemployment compensation, and old age pension security system. And very much the same in India, whereas in India, gender issues were very prominent, and in the Finnish discussion, that has not much been on the agenda. And when it comes to that Canadian experiment in Canada, they have been motivating everything by referring to poverty issues and child poverty especially. So that there are different kind of motivations and different kind of models that will be tried up in those trials that will be launched here and there. And I think that it's good in that sense, because basic income, to somebody, it's solution to all possible problems in the world. And to some other guys, it's from the hand of the Satan, so that it will destroy everything that is good in our societies. And I think that the truth is somewhere in between. And all those experiments that we have and all those analyses that we have are looking at basic income from different angles and providing different kind of data and different kind of evidence. And I think that that's good. And very often those angles may produce different kind of interpretations and different kind of results. And I think that that's not a bad idea and bad thing, but it's good that we will get lots of different kind of evidence from here and there and there. And for example, when it comes to that Finnish experiment and that model that we tried to develop here, it's a little bit different in comparison with that what the OECD has done, and also the results from microsimulations may be a little bit different. And we will now hear much more about the OECD experiment, how they did and which kind of results they received in the microsimulations. And I'm very happy to introduce you senior economist Hervik Immervoll from OECD, where he leads the sector of employment-oriented social policies, and he has a long and wide work history dealing with income distribution, social security, and microsimulations. And he's affiliated to several research institutions in different parts of Europe, and he's one of those most important kinds when we develop in Europe Euromod microsimulation model that is used in very many other countries. Also in Finland, we have experts that are participating in that Euromod microsimulation models. And without further talks, Hervik, I'm really happy that we had possibility to invite you, and you were kind enough to accept our humble invitation. So, Hervik, floor is yours.
Thank you. I need to see here. That would be nice.
Yes. Milla.
Could I see it also on the screen?
Yeah. Well, it should be.
If not, I can just sit there. That's also okay. Did I do that?
Tässä ei näyttää tätä. Tässä. Onko sulla joku?
I can just
I
sit
think
there.
it's the easiest way.
I sit there. Okay. Maybe I take this microphone. Okay, no, it's okay. I can stay here. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Professor Kangas and Killa for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. Olli already said that there's a lot of excitement and interest in the Finnish basic income experiment. This excitement and interest is also shared at the OECD. We very much look forward to the results, but of course we will wait until they're properly available. At the same time, there is considerable pickup of policy debate on this topic in many other OECD member countries, and this is why we also looked into this to provide a contribution to the debate, which I think is very interesting because it touches on key issues in social policy, but also in changes in the labor market, as has been mentioned. The idea on the OECD side was to do a thought experiment. A thought experiment is very different and much easier than a real-world experiment, but this is how this should be seen. So we are not evaluating any real-world policy or experiment, including the Finnish experiment, that is actually happening. We're trying to shine some light on the debate by trying to implement a similar thought experiment in different country contexts, and thereby seeing, okay, what are the pros and cons in different existing social security systems, and what are the pros and cons of moving away from existing configurations to something that is more universal, like a basic income. So the title is Basic Income as a Policy Option. Can it add up? The quick answer is, well, it depends, as you might expect. It depends on the country context. It depends on the existing policies. It depends on what countries are willing to spend, and it depends on what kind of distributional consequences society is willing to accept. So let me tell you more. You all know that the debate, you all know that there is of course the Finnish experiment, but there are also other experiments in other countries, either happening already or planned, and some of them are listed here. And you also know that there was a referendum in Switzerland with a very lively discussion, but at the end a very decisive no vote. That contrasts with international data that has been, opinion data that has been collected recently, which seems to show that in principle people are quite favorable and quite supporting of the idea. So for instance, in the EU, 68% have recently said that they would support a basic income of some sort. But what the results also show in Finland and elsewhere, that if you give people more information about what that actually means, what the benefit level would be, what existing benefits people might lose, what taxes they would need to pay to finance it, then support tends to go down. And so that's why it's important to be relatively concrete about what we mean by a basic income and what sort of framework condition would need to be put in place to actually make it happen. And that's why I think fixing ideas is a relevant contribution to the debate, because the debate has been very lively, but people talk about quite different things when they talk about basic income. They talk about integrating existing minimum income benefits. They talk about specific groups receiving some sort of benefit, and that contrasts with the old sort of very pure idea of a basic income, which has been around for a while, which basically means you give the same benefit to everybody, no matter what, and no questions asked. And in fact, even the OECD has, I found out, done work in this area very, very long ago. So while I was moving offices recently, I found this little note here, which I think is from the mid-70s, from 1974, on the negative income tax, which is not exactly the same as a basic income, but has some interesting links. So it's not a new debate. This is clear, but of course, hopefully we have learned more since then. And what's also clear is that the context, the economic context, has changed very much since then, and is changing. As Olli said very fittingly, something is in the air. People talk about the future of work, future of social protection. People have concerns about how income inequalities have grown in the past, and whether social protection system can keep up with these challenges, or whether more and more gaps will evolve. And so I think the discussion is a very good one to have, either as a concrete policy proposal, or as a useful sort of idea, as a counterfactual for trying to shine light on the strengths and the weaknesses of existing policy configurations. So the purpose of the work that we have done at the OECD is to fix ideas of what would a clean basic income, a very comprehensive basic income, look like in practice. And this is not to say that we are saying countries should move in that direction. We just want to have a contribution to the debate, to have some concrete results on what the consequences of such a move would be. So we're looking at the costs, the fiscal implications, and we look at the implications for individual family income, so for the distributional implications, who would gain and lose. Now, I talked about the future of work and concerns that unstable working careers may lead to greater gaps in social protection coverage, especially if social protection is very much based on stable working contracts. But there are already gaps in existing social protection systems, so it's already a challenge here and now. We don't have to necessarily go into the future to make that point, and that's what's shown here. So basically, one can look at what countries spend in terms of social support and the benefits that they pay out, cash benefits that they pay out to to different groups. And what we show here is people of working age. And then can ask a question, well, how much of that goes to rich people and how much of that goes to low-income people? And the result is one way of looking at this result is displayed here. Now, for the OECD, on average, you get a pattern that maybe you would expect. So there's somewhat greater support paid to the poorest 20% than to the richest 20%. That's shown in the middle here. But there's very, very substantial country variation around that average. So we have on the right-hand side countries that where existing benefits are very weakly targeted to the poor. And in fact, if you look at countries like Italy, for instance, you have about 5 times as much received by higher income groups than by low income groups. Now, there are good reasons for that. If you have a social insurance-based system that is related largely to earnings, then you can get a result like that, especially if social insurance benefits are relatively generous, including early retirement pensions, for instance. But it also indicates, and Italy is a case in point here, that you have coverage problems for low-income groups. So we know that coverage rates of the unemployed, for instance, have gone down since the mid-80s in about 2/3 of OECD countries. And also minimum income benefits, the last resort safety nets, often don't reach the majority of poor people, let's say, and therefore the support to those groups is reduced. But there's also countries on the left-hand side where, in terms of targeting, existing social protection systems appear to work very well, and Finland is among them. So the majority of support goes to lower income groups. Coverage problems are much less important, although there are take-up issues with safety net benefits in all countries, for instance. But the majority of unemployed, for instance, receive unemployment benefit support. And so it's interesting to see that the basic income debate happens across this spectrum. So it's not just limited to countries where you have weak redistribution, because basically what would happen with the basic income is you would flatten out this profile. So the rich would get exactly the same as the poor if you have no other benefits but a basic income and everybody gets the same. And if all countries did that, then you would just have a very unexciting graph here with a flat line. But in several of the countries that we mentioned, including Canada, including Finland, Netherlands, where the basic income debate has gathered steam, the existing the redistribution perspective is less important probably for this debate. So there must be other reasons for this debate. One reason, as in Finland, can be a concern about work incentives. So that partly because of the good targeting to the poor, because benefits received by low-income groups are relatively generous compared to other groups and compared to other countries, there can be a concern that maybe they reduce incentives to work, especially if you lose that benefit when you go into work. And I think the Finnish experiment can be seen in that light. Now, of course, there are criticisms and potential downsides to basic income. You know many of those, but I found it useful just to list them here and to go through them. One is a concern for inefficient targeting. So basically, why should we pay basic income to high household. Why should we do that? And don't we pay with one hand and receive with the other, because we need to raise taxes in order to finance the basic income? But of course, as we have seen here, this is already happening in many countries. Those on the right-hand side, there's already higher benefits received by the rich. So this is an issue perhaps in the basic income debate, but it's also an issue in existing social protection systems. There are high budgetary costs, yes, but we also know that social protection expenditures are already high in existing social protection systems. So again, this is an issue that concerns existing policies as well. And I will look into more detail at these first two criticisms, in a sense, because we look at distributional results and we look at the fiscal implications later in the presentation. And some other criticisms that have been mentioned, and I think are very plausible and often justified, are that if you pay the same amount all the time, irrespective of people's work status, for instance, you have less of an automatic stabilizer. When unemployment goes up, benefits stay exactly the same if you have no unemployment benefit. So that would mean that an unconditional benefit cannot be counter-cyclical. We have concerns about the negative effects on employment of a basic income, which is interesting because from an economist's point of view, and that was also the rationale for the Finnish experiment, a basic income would tend to do exactly the same. It would make work pay more because you don't lose a benefit when you do take up employment. But there are still concerns that maybe giving an income to everybody would that is independent, that is sort of decoupled from work participation, would lead some people to stop working altogether, and that's exactly where we need experiments such as the Finnish one to tell us that, because although we can do some calculations that give an idea, the range of results that one gets from those is usually quite wide, and especially if one looks at big reforms, it's quite difficult to come up with very precise estimates. So we also did not try that in this exercise. We assumed that there are no behavioral adjustments immediately. Maybe later on there are, and for that to say something that's reliable, I think we need to really wait for the results of some of these experiments. One issue, of course, where an unconditional payment can reduce potentially employment is to the extent that existing active labor market policies are successful and require sort of a benefit attached to them to make people participate in them. So if you don't have a conditionality, if you don't tie benefit receipt to registration with the Public Employment Service, to participation in employment programs, to active job search, perhaps through that channel, there could be a negative effect on employment. Again, the judgment on this is out, and the experiments will tell us more. But that definitely is a big concern, especially in many of the OECD countries who have moved over the past years very much to a sort of a rights and responsibility framework, and breaking that conditionality of benefits to people's cooperation with the Public Employment Service, to people's active job search, would be a clear break with this type of principle, so a big policy change. There are also concerns that perhaps basic income would put further downward pressure on wages, because if workers do not have a lot of bargaining power, let's say, there could be attempts by employers to say, okay, you get this additional income from the state now, we probably can pay you less now. But again, this depends very much on the bargaining power of the different parties in the labor market, and is also an issue in existing social protection systems. So you have the debate with in-work benefits, for instance, and this is particularly why countries that have introduced introduced an in-work benefit such as the UK have in parallel had a discussion about minimum wages. So that can be a similar approach can be taken with basic incomes. So overall, yes, these concerns are often justified and plausible, but many or maybe all of them, the concerns also exist with existing social protection systems. So what we need to do is to look country by country, what are the empirical results? What empirical results do we get on costs and benefits? So a starting point is, well, how high should or could a basic income be in different countries? And for that starting point, again, it's useful to look at this idea of basically flattening out existing social benefits so that everybody gets the same. So if we take the spending in existing social protection systems and just divide it by the number of people we want to pay to and pay everybody the same, then this is basically what we would get. So again, this is a thought experiment, but it would mean without raising additional taxes, what could we afford in terms of paying everybody the same, without taking into account any behavioral adjustments, without taking into account any administrative simplification and savings on the administrative side, because it's easier to administer, of course, but as a starting point, as an order of magnitude. And what we see here is that in all countries, if you compare that amount that you get by dividing equally and paying to everybody, if you compare that to the poverty line, the amount is much, much lower than the poverty line. So what that means is that you need to have a parallel discussion with the basic income discussion about financing. If you want to pay a basic income of an amount that provides meaningful poverty alleviation, not necessarily bring people up all the way up to the poverty line, because this probably would lead to a quintupling of benefit expenditures in some countries that are around 20%, for instance here, but getting closer to the poverty line. And that was the starting point of our thought experiment. We thought, well, if the poverty line is sort of too ambitious, is there a less ambitious scenario we could come up with? And we thought, well, something that is less ambitious and is also rooted in countries' existing benefit systems is the safety net that is currently paid, the last resort safety net, what it's called, social allowance, social assistance, guaranteed minimum income, or GMI, as listed here. Now, the levels of these benefits are also significantly below the poverty line in most countries, not in all. Netherlands, for instance, you see here at the poverty line. But they are significantly higher than what you would get by dividing up existing benefit spending equally across the population. So it's sort of an in-between solution that we have taken as a starting point, because that solution also takes you above current benefit spending. It means you also need substantially higher taxes to finance this type of basic income. So in more detail, what does the hypothetical scenario, the thought experiment, look like? And I think this is useful because it also provides a kind of a topology of the different characteristics or features that one might think of when thinking of a basic income. And it also shows that potentially people can talk about very, very different things when they talk about a basic income. So your first question is, of course, who receives it? Who do we pay it to? Is it everybody or certain subgroups of the population? We have chosen a scenario that is very comprehensive, but still doesn't cover the entire population. We are paying it in that thought experiment to everybody who's below the statutory retirement age. So that means old age people, those who are who are above the retirement age, are not affected by the reform, and that's partly because doing so would create all kinds of additional issues, and some of the main questions arising with the basic income concern especially the active population, such as the employment effects that I mentioned. So it's unconditional, it's paid to everybody below the retirement age. That includes working age adults as well as children. Another question is, well, should we replace or keep existing benefits? And one kind of many different sort of solutions in between that. And we have taken a solution in between. So we replace most working age benefits, so that includes unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, child benefits, in-work benefits, early retirement benefits. We're replacing them with the basic income, so they don't exist anymore in the thought experiment. But we're keeping some benefits in place that are intended to compensate for people's concrete additional needs. So that's housing benefits, because it relates to people's housing needs, and paying a flat benefit to everybody cannot, even from the outset, cannot be expected to cover those needs appropriately, and so you would get sort of a trivial result that all these people would lose out, which is not something that is very attractive from a social policy point of view. We also keep in place disability benefits, again, because people have health-related costs which are the justification or a justification for paying disability benefits, and so again we're keeping them in place, but we're reducing them by the amount of the basic income. So because people get the basic income as well, those receiving housing benefits or disability benefits, the overall net benefit is the same as before the reform. But for everybody else, we are replacing existing cash benefits. Cash benefit is important because all services and in-kind benefits are kept in place. So healthcare is not touched, education is not touched, other social services are not touched. I think this is quite a straightforward assumption in a European context, but if you look at the basic income debate in other parts of the world where people have more libertarian type of approach, often the basic income is seen as a way to give people cash so they can buy these services. But of course, this is distributionally not particularly attractive, because the whole point of having services is that are available to everybody is that they're also accessible to the poor. So what amount? That's on the left bottom here. Well, we want to have a scenario across countries that is budgetary neutral, because if you compare across countries, that's basically the only way you can make results comparable. Of course, if you spend a lot more, you can do all kinds of socially useful things, but a useful starting point is to say, okay, if we don't change the budget balance overall, what can we do? And we anchor the amount based on the existing minimum income benefit. So that comes back to this graph here. So that's basically we're using an amount that is similar to those yellow diamonds here. Tax changes, yes, we need to raise additional taxes, as was shown here, to fill that gap basically between the bars and the diamonds. How do we do that? Well, we make the basic income taxable. That means that, yes, higher income groups receive the basic income as well, but because they pay more taxes than lower income groups, in net terms they receive less. So that's distributionally attractive. And we also and that's very important, we abolish the tax-free allowance. So people start paying taxes from the first euro they earn, and there's no zero tax band anymore. That brings in a lot of additional revenue, and that's a solution that's often discussed in parallel with in the basic income debate, and therefore we adopt it. And basically the justification is that, well, if you give everybody a basic income to live on, the rationale for having a tax-free zone in your income tax is less convincing. And finally, is the basic income individual or household based? So basically, does every household get a certain amount, or does every individual get a certain amount? Well, we make it individual-based, again, corresponding to the pure concept of a basic income. So everybody gets the same amount. So a household with several working age people gets several times that basic income amount, which is very different from some of the existing assistance benefits, which assume economies of scale, and so usually the second adult gets less than the first adult, etc. So putting all this together, what do we get? Because we want to make the reform budgetary neutral, we start off by basically fixing the basic income amount at existing social assistance levels, but then we sort of scale it up and down until the budget there's a budget balance. So the budget is budget balance is the same as before the reform. And what we get in 3 of the countries that we're looking at, so we're doing this whole exercise for 4 countries, 4 European countries. In 3 of them, the monthly amount that could be financed through replacing the benefits that I talked about and through the tax changes that I described is relatively close to the to existing social assistance levels. That is the case in Finland, in France, and in the UK. In the UK, it's a little bit below, some 10% below existing social assistance benefits, and that's important to know for the distribution results that I will show later. In Italy, the amount that one gets in a budget neutral scenario is significantly higher than the current social assistance benefit. That's because the social assistance benefit that was actually just introduced last year in Finland is very low. It's about 80 euros per person. And as you can see here, the amount that one gets after tax is about twice that. So basically transforming the existing social protection system into something that is paid to everybody means that Italy could afford to pay significantly more than is currently paid to the poorest. But in all cases, we see that, as one would expect, that the amount of the benefit remains very much lower than the poverty line. So that means an introduction of basic income cannot be expected to just do away with poverty from one day to the next. It can help a lot of people, reduce the poverty gap, get closer to the poverty line, lift some people above it, but not everybody. Now, equally importantly, what are the fiscal effects in aggregate terms? So I said earlier that one needs to have a parallel discussion about tax reforms when talking about a basic income reform, at least a comprehensive one like we have analyzed here. And the extent to which this is true is shown here. So basically, we see on the left-hand side here the savings that one gets from abolishing existing benefits. And with those savings, one can finance part of the basic income. But it's not enough. One also has to increase taxes to keep the reform budgetary neutral, and that's shown on the right-hand side. And we see that the tax increases that are needed to finance it are often significantly bigger, and Finland and the UK in particular, than the savings from abolishing existing benefits. So the tax changes are more important, much more important in aggregate terms than what one does with existing benefit systems. So again, that emphasizes the point that discussions about tax reforms are needed and are required in parallel and as a part of a basic income debate. And the orders of magnitudes are huge here. So you see, for instance, in the UK, plus 6% of tax revenues, and that's 6% of GDP. It's not 6% of existing tax revenues, it's 6% of GDP. In Finland, it's plus 10%. So I think this corresponds to about a third of existing tax revenue. So really, really big changes would be needed to implement a system like this on the tax side. And of course, that means that also the distributional consequences, who gains and who loses, depend a lot on how you implement those tax changes. Do you raise taxes through indirect taxes, through consumption, through VAT, for instance, or through direct taxes, through income taxes? What we do is we raise it through income taxes, because that's the only solution that is possible with the model that we use, which basically does not model the VAT very well. And going from the aggregate perspective to the gains and losses in the population, this is what one gets. So basically, the takeaway point from this slide is that there are very few people whose income remains unaffected. And that's not particularly surprising, because it's a huge reform we are talking about. We are transforming the entire benefit system. We're doing major things on the tax side, of course, that changes the income of many people. But perhaps the extent of it is surprising. Now, we know that, and that's the justification or the attraction of a basic income, that obviously there will be people who gain from a basic income. Those who currently don't receive any benefits, so that's why basic income is a useful discussion when thinking about coverage issues, but also people who don't, who currently don't receive benefits, not because they have low incomes, but because their incomes are too high in order to qualify. They would also gain, or some of them at least. Then there are people whose taxes go up, and they might be seeing losses if the taxes go up more than the basic income than they receive. So they would be in those red bars of this chart here. But more importantly, there are people who lose from a social policy point of view. More importantly, there are people who lose because they lose their existing benefits. And if those existing benefits are targeted in a way to deal, in a very tailored way with social problems, to compensate people for social needs, etc., then this can be a big concern. So, for instance, those who are on early retirement benefits that are typically much higher than the basic income amounts that I've spoken about, they would fall back onto the basic income. They would lose. Those receiving more generous unemployment benefits would lose. And so these are all priority groups in the social policy debate. So looking very carefully at who actually is it, who gains and who loses, is very important when thinking about the feasibility, also the political feasibility of reforms in this direction. And when thinking about the weaknesses, but also the strengths of existing more targeted social protection systems. And there's different perspectives one can take here. So here I show basically the losses, the percentage of people who lose by age group. Of course, there's different. One can also look at gains, and more than 50% in most countries actually gain. But because we're thinking about at this stage also about political feasibility of reforms, it's quite interesting to zoom in on those who lose out and who might resist reforms in that direction. And so we see a pattern here that's quite interesting in three of the countries, in France, Finland, and Italy. It's clearly upward sloping, so there's a lot of older people who lose out, and that's simply because of the prevalence of early retirement benefits that are received by those before the normal statutory retirement age, and they are important in these countries. The pattern in the UK is very different, because in the UK it's not possible to receive a public retirement pension before the statutory retirement age. So there are there's actually fewer losers in the 55 to 64 age range in the UK than in other age ranges. But basically, in most in most countries, what we can say is that a basic income would benefit the young, because often the young are those are the part of the population who are least likely to qualify for benefits, even if they are out of work because they have not built up contribution records, let's say, and they would be costly. They would cause losses among the old, especially if there's a relatively generous early retirement systems in place, generous in terms of the people receiving it. We can also look at the pattern of losses by income group. And here we see sort of a bit of a U shape. So we see more losses in Finland, in France, and in the UK at the bottom and at the top. That is because at the bottom you have often a large number of people who currently receive benefits, which are higher than the basic income. So these people would lose. That's especially visible in the UK. So, for instance, you see that in the second 10%, in the second decile, there's a very large number of people losing. That's because the second decile in the UK is those who basically receive the current means-tested social assistance, the last resort benefit. And I said earlier that to make the reform revenue neutral or budgetary neutral in the UK, we had to go a little bit below that benefit level. And so a lot of these people of current benefit recipients would lose out. In the lowest income group in the UK, the number of losers is less, and that's because there's a big coverage or a benefit take-up problem in the UK, where a lot of people who have low incomes and would theoretically qualify for social assistance do not receive it for one reason or another. With a basic income, of course, they would receive it, so that coverage gap would be plugged. And so in the lowest 10%, a lot of people would gain, and the number of losers is less. But in general, you see that in the middle, there's the fewest losers in the middle income range. That's because in the middle income range, people are least likely to receive benefits in the current system, and they are not yet, they would not yet be affected, given their income levels, by the tax changes as much as higher income taxpayers. And so the higher income taxpayers would lose out simply because they are the main people paying for the tax increases that we put in place to pay for the basic income reform. In Italy, the result is interesting because it's very, very flat. So basically, yes, you have losses among existing benefit recipients, for instance. But as shown earlier, the benefit system in Italy is very weakly targeted. So basically, you have benefit recipients across the whole income spectrum. So you have losers everywhere, and so it's much less clear who gains and who loses, and that reflects the poor targeting in existing social protection system. An interesting perspective, the last one that I have on the result here, is on well, what does this mean for poverty? I already said, well, the universal basic income amount would be below the poverty line, so it would not eradicate poverty, okay, but what would actually happen to poverty rates? And of course, you have some people who have income somewhere between zero and the poverty line currently and don't have a lot of benefit support. They might be lifted above the poverty threshold, and that's shown in the green box here. So that's the percentage of below retirement age people who would be lifted above the poverty line by a basic income, but at the same time you have people who are either just above the poverty line, and because of higher taxes maybe they fall below it, or who may be significantly above the poverty line, let's say early retirement pensioners or recipients of unemployment insurance benefits. But if you reduce their benefit level because they lose this these types of support to a basic income level, which is lower, then they would fall below the poverty line, and that's shown in the red box here. And so in all countries except Italy, the numbers in the red box, so those falling below the poverty line, is bigger than those in the green who are lifted above. So in net terms, it means that poverty, as conventionally measured, would increase here. Again, in this particular scenario, there can be different scenarios, but it's budgetary neutral, and it does not include any consideration for employment effects, etc. So to sum up, what are the budgetary and distributional effects of a comprehensive basic income that we have considered? So if we look at a budgetary neutral BI for individuals below the normal retirement age, what that means is we're looking at a relatively modest basic income level that's significantly below the poverty line. To make it budgetary neutral, we need to abolish almost all existing benefits, and we need substantial additional tax revenues. Putting this together has implications for who gains and who loses, and for the effectiveness of redistribution in the system. And I think that shines a very useful light on the gaps in existing social protection systems, but also on the strengths of existing social protection systems. So if you have a well-targeted benefit system right now, then moving to something that is not targeted by definition, which is what the basic income is, poverty risks can increase because current benefit recipients lose out, basically. And that's especially the case in countries that have very tightly knit social protection, so where the non-coverage issue is not as big a deal, but there are a lot of recipients of current support who might lose out. It's also especially the case for older working age individuals, if you have a lot of people receiving early retirement pensions, but also other types of benefit recipients might lose out, the unemployed receiving benefits, but also some other situations that are currently, families in other situations who currently benefit from very targeted types of support, such as lone parents, for instance. If you pay the same amount to every child and every adult, then you don't have additional support for lone parents, for instance. So what that means is that one needs to think very carefully whether basic income reform needs to be embedded into some other types of benefits that alleviate those losses, socially undesirable losses. And what that means is that one would go from a very comprehensive, very simple basic income that is paid to everybody instead of existing benefits to something different, to something partial, to something that is somewhere in between that very far-reaching reform and existing social forms of social protection. So a partial basic income, what if we moved to that? What are the pros and cons? And there's different ways of going in that direction. One could leave existing benefits, make existing benefits more accessible. So instead of introducing something new in countries that don't have universal child benefits, for instance, the child benefit could be made universal, and that would be a much less revolutionary reform than a basic income. And although Finland and many other countries have universal child benefits in about half the OECD countries, that's not the case. So that's something to consider. One could also, instead of replacing existing benefits, introduce the basic income as an additional transfer on top of everything else, or on top of most of the existing types of support. Now, of course, what that would do is it would make it even more expensive. So then one would need to look even more closely at how to raise additional taxes, because one doesn't have available the savings from abolishing existing benefits. One could also have a much lower basic income amount, even lower than we have considered. Now, of course, this would mean that the poverty effects would be even less attractive. The patterns in terms of poverty before and after the reform. So as a main sort of anchor for social protection system, probably this is not very useful if this is the only benefit that's around. But it could still be a useful discussion to have if the focus of the discussion is not so much plugging coverage gaps in existing social protection systems, but something else. For instance, more equally dividing up the gains of globalization or of economic growth, or making incomes less coupled to people's activity, and then even a small amount can be meaningful in that direction. One could also lower recipient numbers by retaining some sort of conditionality, and that has been proposed in the form of a participation income. So only people who either look for work, who volunteer, who undertake care activities would get the basic income. So you have some conditionality in there, and of course this is possible, but it means, but in order to reduce recipient numbers significantly, you would have to have quite strong conditionality attached, and then some of the attractions of a basic income kind of fade away because it would no longer be simple to administer. You would have to have all these administrative mechanisms in place in order to check up on what people are doing. One could also, and that's the last partial option that I list here, one could also lower the initial cost, but also the losses by phasing in a basic income. So not replacing existing social protection system from one day to the next with a lower, relatively low amount, which underlies the losses that I have described. But for instance, start paying new cohorts of young adults the basic income, and leave all the other social protection measures for older cohorts in place, because that's only a part of the population that would often obviously be fiscally less expensive. It would also mean that because those new cohorts of young adults typically don't yet have built up entitlements to other benefits, they would not face losses. Now, of course, implementing something like this is not simple, but it has some attractions, and in some countries there have been interesting discussions that have some resemblance to this type of proposal in the form of individual accounts, where in Germany, for instance, and in France, this discussion is ongoing, where governments credit people, young people, once they reach adulthood, a certain amount in an individual account, and then they have some freedom on how to use that and when to use it to finance work-related to breaks from employment, for education, for starting a new business, for caring responsibilities, etc. And this is where I will stop. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hervik. And then we have commentator Markus Kanerva, who is just now sitting in the Prime Minister's office, and more precisely in the experimental division in there. And Markus was participating in the planning of the Finnish experiment, and I think that he's a very proper person to comment on the presentation. But once again, thank you very much, Hervik.
Good morning from my behalf. So as mentioned, I'm from Prime Minister's office, but I'm only a partial government official, so I work the other week, and I take that as a liberty to also present also my own ideas. So don't take my message as a greetings from the Prime Minister's office. Because otherwise this would be a very, very boring presentation, because there's nothing to said or really comment that would be worthwhile for you guys here. I'd like to compare basic income to goji berries. Goji berries is a so-called superfood. There are a lot of good things that goji berries are supposed to do for you. You can have a perfect skin and less cancer and everything you can think of. And I think basic income seems to be that kind of a policy reform, especially if you talk with people who are proponents of basic income. So that's gonna eradicate poverty, that gonna make people to be more engaged to starting small companies, and so on and so on. There's a lot of good things from basic income, but when you hear too many good things, you start thinking that, can this really be true? And in that sense, a brief or a research done by OECD, what you had presented here, is very welcomed, because a lot of times you see research and reports where you either want to prove that basic income is nonsense, or you want to prove that this is the best thing in the world. And I can't really say if you're against basic income or in favor of basic income based on a paper, so I think that's a good sign for your work. But some comments. You go for the standing point that you have the budget neutrality, and I understand why you chose that. That's what you see in this type of simulations most of the time. But I think that's something that should be sometimes also challenged. Because if you would do reforms always based on the budget neutrality, there would never be any bigger reforms. If you think about the progress we've seen in social policies, so there have been points where politicians took the leap of faith and took the investments to schooling and social benefits, thinking that, okay, we don't have the money yet, but this is gonna pay off later for us. So in that sense, it would be nice to see also more analysis where you look into this aspect to see also with a wider budgets. Okay, I mentioned that there are a lot of good things attached to basic income. My favorite good thing is about the cognitive load that the current system is giving to people, and I think if we would have a much simpler system that could free up people's cognitive skills to make better decisions for themselves and use their time for applying right jobs for themselves or make other better decisions for themselves. And as we saw in the results, so there were losses more common among the poor, and I think it would be interesting to study and look further a situation where maybe even though you would receive a less amount of money, but if you were sure about what is the amount you're getting regularly, would a lower amount be enough, kind of like compensate the uncertainty that you have? I have backgrounds in behavioral economics, and there's a fantastic example about how people avoid uncertainty called Ellsberg's paradox, and that's a situation where people are asked to pick either a black or red ball from two different urns, and make a bet if they can pick the right ball, and people really tend to pick the ball from the urn where they know the probabilities, compared to the other urn where you don't know the probabilities. So people are ready to take up things where you have a certain probability for things rather than have a little risk there. Going back to your model, it's very well defined, and it's nice how you get to be a little bit of a politician when you're preparing a simulation like this, or like we're preparing the Finnish basic income experiment, because you need to have some kind of model there to look into. The good or the bad thing is that those type of models tend to stick. So I don't know if there are already politicians who are referring to the OECD model of basic income. I think your model is actually quite balanced, and if a politician would pick that up, that wouldn't be a very bad thing either, actually. But when it comes to Finland, the governing coalition, in my opinion, they don't really have a specific model that they would like to test. And I feel that in my position in the Prime Minister's office, I've been kind of like a PR person for raising the Finnish, the Finland's country brand value by talking to different journalists about the model, or about the experiment, that they are kind of like looking into Finland, okay, you are going further, having this fantastic experiment, and you are going to have basic income in the near future. I'm kind of like, whoa, you're just going too far. I haven't seen any proper plans from the government coalition, so it's more like a practical exercise that we've been doing here. Okay, now I have a couple of slides I'd like to share with you. Last fall, I contacted different Finnish parties. I want to discuss with them about the basic income idea, and these are unpublished comments or summaries for them. So I want to discuss with them how they see different aspects of basic income, and I think this explains quite well why they think about different topics. So, for instance, when it comes to conditionality in social benefits, Green Party, they oppose that, which is not a surprise. Christian Democrats, they are in favor. Swedish Party in favor. Left Alliance, they oppose, because it doesn't belong to basic income, and Left Alliance is very much in favor of basic income in general. Then the Social Democrats, they don't have time for me, so I met the Central Organization of Finnish Trade Unions, so SAK, and they were, of course, in favor, and the National Coalition Party, it's a bit split, but majority favors. True Finns, or the second choice, however you would translate the newly built party, they didn't have time to meet me either, and so didn't the Central Party. Yes. And then about the benefits, if they are means tested. So surprisingly, Green Party thought that was a good thing, whereas in a basic income system you wouldn't have benefits mean tested at all. And the Central Organization for Trade Unions, so they thought that, okay, people have a need for unemployment insurance, so they were feeding me their all propaganda. What is interesting is how these actors see the future of work. Green Party, they think that occupations will disappear. Christian Democrats, they think that artificial intelligence will not destroy jobs. Swedish Party, they're not worried. Left Alliance, they are a bit worried that this will go more in a gig economy, and therefore basic income would be a good solution. SAK thought that, okay, if we're going to lose jobs, so there will be less income taxes levied and no chance for basic income. The National Coalition Party thought that there will be changes, but that will not affect the amount of work. And from other sources, the Social Democrats also think that there will not be big changes in the future of work. And if this is really your point of view, then you understand why they don't think basic income as a good solution. And the last column is about if basic income will affect the willingness to work. And there are quite big differences between these actors. And I think this is the major concern about basic income, and if you can have that as a new model to overhaul social security system. And this is also where experiments come in place. And I think field experiments, where you can really study if unconditional benefits, which are not means tested, if they will make people lazier or not, that's a topic that the field experiments can shine light into. And this is a part that naturally you could not have in your simulation, but I think we should have both type of studies to be done, simulations to see the premises, to see that, okay, kind of like doing the chemical analysis of the goji berry, but also have field experiments to see if the goji berry is really making and giving you what people are claiming that it can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus. Your presentation was good, and it was exceptional in that sense that usually comments and commentators, they have nothing to say about the very presentation, so that you commented on the presentation that Hervik had. Thank you for that. But before I open the floor for open discussion and some questions, Hervik, would you like to comment on comments?
Comment on the comments. Well, thank you very much, Markus. Thank you for reading carefully the study. I think I agree with most of what you said. I totally agree on the cognitive load argument, and there are many systems in our member countries, benefit systems, that are incredibly complex. They are usually not complex intentionally or by design, but for historical reasons. So in that sense, the basic income debate is incredibly positive, I think, because it contrasts something very complex with the simplest thing you can imagine. And so if that leads to reforms that address some of the complexity, not necessarily so much the administrative complexity and how that creates difficulties for the government or for the administrations in their day-to-day work, but I think more importantly, the complexity as perceived by those who are the intended recipients of support. So if there are discussions of how to integrate multiple existing benefits, which we've seen in France, for instance, as a follow-up to the basic income debate that bubbled up very strongly during the presidential campaign in France, then this is very positive. And it doesn't really matter if whether people correctly, in a technical sense, refer to their reform ideas as a basic income, or whether it's something quite different. Simplification and integration can be very useful, I think, in that sense. And related to that, of course, if you have a greater certainty about that you will receive support when you need it, then this also means that maybe people are quite happy to trade in something complex for something that is a bit lower and more certain. But I think what the results show that that I have talked about, if you have a comprehensive reform, it would not just be a little bit lower, it would be a lot lower. And so I still have some doubts whether distributionally this is very attractive, especially for the weakest parts of societies. I take it as a compliment what you said, Markus, about the models tend to stick, because I think the way you framed it is that we have carefully thought through it. But again, I would emphasize, and I emphasize whenever I talk about this, that this is not at all a proposal. This is something very hypothetical and a thought experiment. If some elements of it stick, then that's very good, especially if the qualifications stick. But I'm less worried that governments will go out and say, okay, the OECD's model, we will introduce this. It would be quite unique in our experience, actually. I mean, even if we go out and have a very concrete proposal with recommendations attached to it, some parts survive the political process, but rarely the entire package. So I'm pretty relaxed on that one.
Thank you very much. Then we have some time for short questions. Please, the floor is open here, front, and Olli Kärkkäinen, then Ilari, Keso, and yeah. So first Olli and then Ilari.
I'm Pekka Elonheimo, president of BN Finland, which is network of basic income supporters in Finland. And it was really interesting, both of the presentations. What we have done in Finland is now we have a small experiment, 2,000 people, and only those who are long-term unemployed. As myself, I didn't get into that. I wish I would have done it, because now I have only two options. If I get a good job, okay, I'll do it. But if I don't, and I get small income, basically 85% of the income will be taken away from me, because the last resort money, toimeentulotuki, there is the cut. They only give me 20% what's left after taxes. And so if I teach in, for example, school, I'm priest by occupation, one day I get about 100 euros. And taxes take 20 euros from it, and then the Kela takes 65 of it. So I get 15 euros, and I don't want to teach 50-year-olds one day with that salary. That's the difficulty with our current system. It really is, in theory, encouraging to work and forcing to work, but in practice, it makes us lazy because we can't do anything to better our position. 25 years ago, I I had a small computer company which gave me and 7 other people living. Then the Soviet Union vanished and our biggest customers there. I went bankrupt, lost my job, my marriage, and became unemployed supporter for children. I had a dissertation almost finished about religion and politics in Finland. Guess what the social security and employment people said? They said if I go on studying, I don't get any benefits at all. So I had to abandon that doctoral dissertation which I had worked for 5 years already. And if I had finished that, had allowed to finish that, I would be in a very different position now.
Okay.
So that's, I will ask 2 questions.
Yes, please.
This system is preventing us our own choices. I can't go from unemployed to study or part-time work almost at all. And basic income would help us do that. But is there going to be a better experiment in basic income than what is now done? We would need bigger numbers, unemployed, but also varied groups. Now we don't get...
Next question, please.
Now we don't get very many-sided results because long-term unemployed are the least people who get work. The other question, well, if you can even answer that one, is there going to be another and bigger experiment in Finland?
I can answer that question. The question is we don't know. It's in the hands of the politicians, and as you know, political turns in this country can be very interesting ones. So that we don't know. We are hoping for that, but we don't know.
Thanks. I'm Olli Karkkainen from Nordea, and I have a question for Helwig about the model and the pensioners in the model. You said that the basic income would be paid to those under the statutory pension age, 65, but most people in the data are between 60 and 65 are actual pensioners, not on early retirement pensions, because their retirement age was low when they retired. So what are you doing with the pensions? Do the actual pensioners, not the early retirement people, lose their pensions with the basic income? Because that would explain the big number of people losing between 55 and 65.
Thank you very much, Olli. And then Ilari Keso. Please, Ilari.
Okay. I'm Ilari Keso from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health.
Put the microphone closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's
okay,
better.
Fine. Thank you. Ilari Keso from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. You remove earnings-related benefits from the working age individuals. But I think you do not make any changes in social insurance contributions. I'm meaning employee and employer contributions. Do you think this is problematic?
And then one last question.
Thank you, Vivan Stålund. I'm an independent researcher, one of those who doesn't fit the labor model. But I think the OECD would have been the really appropriate body to also look into the dynamic economic effects of a basic income. So I was very disappointed actually that you sort of worked with a budget neutral models. So did you have any discussions about the dynamic effects? Because I think they would be very big, and particularly at the local economic level.
Thank you very much. And Hervik, when it comes to the first question, you can force our government by saying that the OECD dictates that Finland should start a better experiment 2019. So that the directive from OECD would be good for us.
Well, you have to tell me more what you would like to hear from me.
Yeah, we can discuss it later on, so that you will get the receipt. And here are my colleagues from the experimental group and some other experts. We can give you a list.
Yes, no, that's great. And in fact, this is exactly what the experiment should do. It should also stir a debate and sort of whet the appetite for more. And we don't see that enough in many of our countries, of our member countries. There's not enough of a culture for evidence-based and for learning from experiments. And even if there is, it's very rare that this is so much out in the open and gets people engaged and thinking about it, and hopefully also a dynamic to strengthen that culture further. And in the future, it will be easier for Olli and colleagues to get support from us, definitely, but more importantly, hopefully also from the decision makers in the country to undertake experiments of this sort, to learn more about many of the effects that you spoke about. Some of the concrete questions on pensioners from Olli. Yes, we abolished them. So these are the losers, and that's what drives the results. You can have different views on that. It's in line with views that have strengthened in past decades, that yes, we would actually like to reduce the generosity of benefit support for that population groups for various reasons. And the basic income reform scenario that we look at would not be the only way to do that. This has also already been done in the past. Of course, this is problematic, and many of the elements that we look at in this thought experiment are problematic in the real world, because the change is huge, and it's a revolutionary change. So if you have a revolutionary change, you can expect quite a few opponents, and the pensioners, whether you call them early retirement pensioners or regular pensioners below 65, they would be among those opponents. The issue is that if we would not do that in the scenario, then the costs would be much higher, and you would have much more significant losses in some of the other population groups who maybe are more likely to be in poverty. The earnings-related benefits are removed, Ilari, yes. And at the same time, of course, the question is, well, if we remove the benefit, what happens with the contributions that are meant to finance those benefits? So, yes, that would be, and it partly overlaps with the question regarding regarding pensioners, at least in countries where pensions are strongly earnings related. So yes, this would be also among the opponents of such a reform. We do not change social security contributions. What that means, in effect, is in our simulations that we transform the contributions into a tax. Of course, one could do different things. One could, on the financing side, dream up all kinds of possible tax reforms to raise the revenue that is necessary. The problem is, if you do that in any specific country, but definitely in a cross-country, in a comparative context, it becomes very arbitrary. So we could say, okay, we abolish social contributions and we raise income taxes much, much more. But then how do we do that? So our starting point was that we wanted to work as much as possible within the existing system, because if you start changing policy parameters in all kinds of policy areas, then the danger is that the results are driven by those things rather than by the basic income, and it becomes quite difficult to interpret what the results you get across countries. Thank you for the question on the dynamic effects. That's very important. I mean, dynamic effects, I think you talked about implicitly mainly fiscal dynamic effects, so how that would play out. But also for individuals, that's very important. We have a very static analysis here. So we're looking at the day after effects, basically, if you like. If you introduce this, what would happen to people's incomes? And of course, this can only be the starting point, but I think it's a very important starting point to have, because we did not know that before, and did not know that before in a cross-country context. And if you have a political discussion, then probably the support and the opposition that you get is very much driven by the immediate consequences that people perceive for the incomes. Now, having said that, there are important dynamic effects also in the sense that people who are not maybe benefiting in that 1 year from the basic income, they may be in a situation where they benefit later on, especially if projections are correct that automation and the future of work would lead to some more fragmented employment, less stable employment. Then maybe those who are affected by this change would actually in future years be among the gainers of a basic income, and they would therefore benefit at some point, and they would also benefit in the sense that they know they can rely on it, whatever happens to their family situation, whatever happens to their career, and that's very important, I think. But we have not looked into it. Something we have looked at is the incentive effects. So the incentive, not the incentive effects, but the incentive, the financial incentives to work, and what would happen to those. So we used the OECD tax benefit models for a wider range of countries. Basically what you find is what you would expect, but it's not obvious. I think it's important to think through it, that you get stronger incentives for current benefit recipients because they don't lose the benefit when they go into work. That's also what you had talked about. You also get stronger incentives because the overall benefit level is lower, which also encourages work in some sense than some of the existing benefits. But you get weaker incentives in some cases for especially second earners. So that's interesting from a gender equality point of view. Maybe not so much an issue in Finland, but if you look at Italy, for instance, or some of the southern European countries, and that's because you have tax increases that are needed to finance the basic income, and the tax increases affect especially those couples where there's a question of whether the second earner should work or not. So it's not all positive on the incentive side as well, and I think more work needs to be done, and maybe that can also be teased out from the experiment to look at different family types and how they react in terms of their employment to having that certainty of a basic income for 2 years at least.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation and thought-provoking presentation. And Markus, thank you for your comments. And the audience, thank you for good questions. And I think that we all, and first of all, Hervik Ingvar and Markus deserved big hand.
And there is this policy brief by the OECD is available there in the back.
Yes, please help yourself.
Yes, I know. So that